This is Duke University.
When my son was 15 years old, he recorded this message on our answering machine. If you believe in the narrative construction of reality, leave a message for Wahneema. If you believe in the social construction of reality, leave a message for Raphael. If you don't give a damn about reality, leave a message for Jaffe. I'm starting with two epigraphs. The first language is from Oliver Cox's magisterial 1948 study, Class, Caste, and Race. Quote, "We cannot defeat race prejudice by proving that it is wrong. The reason for this is that race prejudice is only a symptom of a materialistic social fact. The white man's ideas about his racial superiority are rooted deeply in the social system and can be corrected only by changing the system itself," end quote. And then a second piece of language. If Africa, quote, "if Africa can be understood to be underpolluted, then certainly we can think about the lack of attention to the pathologies of the rich overclass as a field of under-scrutiny," end quoted. This language is excerpted from Basil Nosferatu's groundbreaking study, Clint Eastwood's Baby Mamas, 50 Years of the Sociopathology and Familial Aesthetics of Rich White Men, 1960 to 2010. Okay, I made up that second epigraph. And the book title, and the author, and you can ask me about it later. But it is Cox's exhortation that we have to change the system itself, and he made it clear in his work that he was talking about capitalism and its foundation for a social hierarchy that I most want us to keep in mind, yet at the same time, I do not want to sever racism's connection to that materiality. I'm interested here in thinking about racism as ideology, as a species of common sense that shares with many other instances of common sense qualities of extreme resilience, rhetorical efficiency, and strong resistance to informed analyses, elaborated arguments, and critiques of its own interpretive prowess. Racism as common sense obfuscates the viciousness of our social system. It draws our attention away from structures of general inequality. It necessarily draws our attention away from the structural work of capitalism as it produces class harm that is then falsely understood to be individual insufficiency and/or racial group pathology. It allows material reality to be shunted to the background by foregrounding continual stories of Black individual and group failure, Black pathology, and Black loss, compared to the myths of U.S. individual heroism and myths of individual self-empowerment among those who are unmarked. Under this view, individual excellence is the domain of the dominant political ethnicity, or in other and shorter words, the myths understood to be white. It plays its part in material effects by encouraging public discussion to make sense of the world in ways that do not depend for their efficacy on accuracy, as Oliver Cox was pointing out in the first epigraph. Racism depends instead on its simplicity as explanatory narrative and a means of congealing aesthetic and affective responses to the material world, or what I've called the affective career of race. I teach critical interpretation of social texts. So what I'm talking about today comes out of a course I'm teaching right now on prison, the U.S., and the carceral imagination, and one that I taught to first-year students in the spring. Doing that course requires that I put work into demystifying the relations that suture together our consent not just to being governed, but our consent to having that governance understood in the lingua franca of, quote, what is natural, what is most apparent to the meanest intelligence, what we take for granted, end quote. In other words, ideology at the level of the everyday. It means that I address the familiar, the ordinary, in order to make sense of racism as a narrative that organizes selective attention and scrutiny, or narrative as a way to make you unsee, to think about what Angel was talking about. Narrative is a way to make you unsee, in fact, what you do see. Racism as a social narrative is a kind of everyday, imaginative, and ugly commons. It belongs, although unevenly so, to the whole of a social order. It is an account about which everyone feels free to hold opinions, a set of accounts that people can latch onto at the drop of a hat. It has a powerful simplifying effect. It produces and reinforces a massive set of assumptions that have circulated for a few hundred years. But what might be especially useful to keep in mind in this historical conjuncture as we consider the viciousness and the successfulness of that narrative is that the narrative of Black pathology with regard to poverty and unemployment is an increasingly generalized address to the larger social order. One could, for example, exhaust and nauseate oneself reading articles about Republican elected officials demeaning the unemployed, the poor, working or not, the people dependent upon food stamps, et cetera, as, quote, lazy, shiftless, unwilling to bestir themselves in order to better their conditions, end quote. You've all heard or read this. The pervasiveness of immiseration generally spreading, is now providing new rhetorical ground for extending old and very familiar tropes and stereotypes, but with new subjects in mind. In fact, one could call it, and I frequently do, the Negroidization of the general U.S. less well-off population. Shared and varied demographic misery might itself prove a new testing ground for social control via rhetorical gerrymandering, a kind of proof that racism can be assigned situationally without the actual presence either of the word race or the skin color. It is truly a customizable application. I'm surprised that some smartphones haven't already been equipped with an app for it. Perhaps one of the narrative's most common appearances is connected to public discussions of Black poverty and crime. In those moments, the unbridled democracy of anti-intellectual ignorance is flagrantly on display. Think about the continual replaying of this kind of scene. A local news anchor cuts from discussion of some form or instance of crime where the offender is Black American, or some form or instance of poverty, unemployment, and or the need for social services, topics that are always readily at hand, and decides to listen to the gamut of confident assertions about what needs to be done so that the problems of the hood or the ghetto, the stand-in for Black people more generally speaking, are addressed. The woman or man with a microphone confidently marches up to a person on the street and queries, "Do you think that racism is still a problem?" And some commonsensical form of racism is promptly and confidently re-articulated by that person on the street. I'm going to end this with a particularly insidious example that, of course, comes out of the 2 prison courses. And that's the phrase, Black on Black violence, or Black on Black crime. That phrase is a constant presence on the agenda of many Black organizers and activists, and it is also deployed in order to interrupt criticism of police violence against Black people, criticism of disparate sentencing, criticism of mass incarceration, and criticism of vigilante violence against members of the group. And yes, I'm talking about the murder of Trayvon Martin. I see in mass circulation, print, media, online, and real life, how that phrase works rhetorically to interrupt conversation. And I know as well that both Black Americans and non-Black Americans alike trade in the currency of this phrase, often out of concern for what happens in Black communities, and sometimes out of a reflexive scolding gesture, or what I refer to as the Bill Cosby genre of public thought. For me, the why of the gesture isn't as important as what the gesture does, regardless of who's speaking the phrase. It's another means by which purported Black American singularity is moved into rhetorical position to further cement our pathology. It introduces inadequate generalizations instead of the relationships, the complex connections that require considerable elaboration in order for us to make sense of crime, of policing, and of juridical processes. What happens within the ambit of this phrase and its popularity? To see how it works, compare it to a different, a non-existent, a counterfactual category, quote, white-on-white violence or white-on-white crime. How many of you have ever seen instances of this category in common parlance? Crickets. What exactly would be an example of white-on-white crime? Bernie Madoff, Enron, the Macy Coal Company, rich white kids in gated communities and mansions who put homemade bombs in their neighbors' mailboxes. Would that be rich white kid on rich white neighbor crime? And what about domestic violence among white Americans? Is that white spouse on white spouse violence? In the moment of prohibition and the quite horrific rate of organized crime violence then, especially among white ethnic crime groups, did we speak of white-on-white violence? In the common social parlance of reputable newspapers, for example, is organized crime violence described in terms of ethnic categories, Italian on Italian murders? Do we have a category of white meth dealers on white meth dealer violence for meth-related killers? Or white cocaine dealer on white cocaine dealer violence? We don't have those things because such categories would work to misdirect our attention away from making social sense. Black on black violence is racism dressed up in common sense narrative understanding. It makes us stupid and produces at the same time more Black American singular pathology understandings. So, Tim.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.